Startups get the party, startups get the party started. Startups get the party, startups get the party started. You want tech and tacos, tacos and tech, you know we got it, eh? Startups get the party, startups get the party started. Startups get the party, startups get the party started. Startups get the party, startups get the party started. You want tech and tacos, tacos and tech, you know we got it, eh?
And welcome back to the Tacos and Tech podcast. I'm your host, Neil Bloom, and I'm thrilled to have on Peter Goldsborough from Rune, co-founder and CTO. Hey, Peter, thanks for joining the pod.
Hey Neil, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It is great to be here with you, and thanks for joining us on the other side of the country there. You're inside, you're warm, which is good because it's a little cold out right now.
It is cold outside. It's funny. I was just in Colorado Springs the past few days, and you'd think that high up and in the mountains it'd be colder than here, but not right now. It's very cold here.
Well, luckily we all of us are heads down busy building because it is build season right now. And so everyone's inside just punching away at building the next hardware, which I'm excited to talk about. You've been a part of a bunch of developing a lot of really interesting hardware and software, and now working on Rune. Do you mind giving us a quick overview, high level, what Rune is?
Yeah, absolutely. In short, Rune is a company focused on military logistics technology. Right? We think that's one of the key missing areas of investment when it comes to defense technology in the past few years, and that's our bread and butter. That's what we go deep on.
Amazing. Well, there's a huge need. There's been so many, macro global events that have happened to highlight that need recently. And we're going to dive deep into all of that. But first, I want to get to know how you found that need. Where does it all start for you as a young Peter getting into the technology world?
Yeah, before Rune, I was at Anduril for a couple of years, for 4 years as a software engineer and chief engineer at the end. And I had the opportunity there to work with some incredible people and some incredible programs and really important problems, most importantly, in the command and control space, in the fire space, intelligence. And I eventually just realized, there were a lot of really important problems being worked on, but none of them seemed to be focused on logistics. And I'm a bit of a history buff, and I just knew that most major wars in history were won or lost based on logistics, right? Even in World War II, whether it's in the Pacific or in Europe, logistics was key, right? Whenever you saw, Masters of the Air, the recent sort of, show there, when they were doing bombing raids, they were going after factories and supply lines, right?
Mhm.
Logistics has always mattered. And then when I looked at what logistics looks like across the DoD today, what I saw was whiteboards and Excel spreadsheets and pieces of paper. And I just realized, nobody was putting that same level of emphasis on logistics. And, from past history or even Ukraine, that just seemed like an oversight that was going to come back to haunt us.
Yeah, 100%. Well, okay, we're gonna get there in a second, but why software engineering for you? What was the first like introduction to it? And do you remember your first project you built?
Yeah, so a little bit about me. So I was born and raised in Austria. My dad's American, but my mom's Austrian and grew up in Austria most of my life there. I got introduced to software engineering when I was about 15. I'm entirely self-taught. My high school was a language school. I learned French and Latin, and I had like an hour of math every week and no computer science. So for me, it was all online, and I just fell in love with it. I think I'm a builder at heart, and I found something that would let me build and use my creativity, and it's obviously helped me build still today.
Yeah, I'm sure. Uh, Man, who could have thought large language models would change a little bit of the game of building of software? But you've done both startups and big tech to a certain regard. I'm curious, through that journey, have you seen how technology and software specifically has been developed differently? I mean, do people master, building software, or is that all off the table now in the age of AI and code co-pilots and all that?
I do think I'm glad I grew up in an age where AI wasn't there yet because I did have to actually learn the hard things about hard things in a way and understand the nuance. I think or even just internally at Rune, where we just had discussions around, AI is so helpful as a productivity tool, but if you don't have the taste to look at, what it's doing, whether it's the right thing, you could actually end up with accumulation of a lot of tech debt. And so I'm glad that I actually learned the core skills, and now I just feel like I have superpowers, and I can have 50 versions of me, as agents, doing the work. But I'm glad I have some classical training, as we may end up calling it in a couple of years.
Right? Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. The other big piece about product development is who you work with, right? And knowing how to work with people. Really, it's the communication style, right? Division of labor. And what I noticed about your background is, you've worked, I believe, Facebook to Android to now, I think, I'm guessing there's some people who've worked together at a few companies together, right? There's the Oculus crew that got ingested into Facebook.
Yeah.
Was that some of the talent and team that have kind of built together over multiple companies?
Yeah, I mean, I even brought some of my peers from Facebook to Admiral after I joined because, I was like, hey, this company is really awesome. We're building some important things, and the technology is really interesting. And, good people like to work with good people. And so, I just wanted to have my friends around, and I brought a couple with.
Yeah, I mean, talent density means a lot, right? Like having to go search for talent versus knowing you've got someone ready to just call and say, "Hey, we're building this thing, come join us." That
Yeah.
saves time, which is saves product development, which saves iterations, with the customer. Tell us a little bit about kind of early Android days around that? Like, what was the difference in speed that you saw product development compared to Facebook? I don't mean to put the two of them together, by the way, just like big tech and startup tech. Like, what's the difference between the two of them that you've seen in terms of product development?
Yeah, it's interesting because Facebook obviously had the move fast and break things motto, but towards the tail end when I left, it had grown well beyond that, and it was not moving fast, and it also stopped breaking things, which is probably a good thing at that size. But when I joined Andal, we were about 200 people, and we still had that nimble agility to actually move fast and not break things because in the DoD that's also important not to do, but to actually just have small focused teams and the thing that I really, really enjoyed about Anduril, and I think that also helped us move faster, is people actually really, truly cared about what was being worked on, right? The mission really mattered, and sitting next to people side by side who actually, cared about what we were doing, that was really motivating, and that made the long nights a lot more palpable.
Yeah. What about just adding hardware as a dimension compared to, big tech where it's all software? What
Yeah.
is suddenly you're not, the big player per se, the big department. What's that like being a software developer providing hardware, to
Yeah,
them?
I mean, I certainly, when I was at Facebook, did not think that a temperature or vibration was ever going to mess with my software.
Yeah.
So I think it was a really interesting realization that the physical world is hard, and every constraint you forget about or glance over is going to come back and bite you. And so
Mm.
that was a really unique insight in Android. Building hardware and software for hardware is, yeah, the physical world is actually really difficult.
Yeah, and obviously, a challenge worth taking on because you've leaned into it in your own startup now with Rune. Take us through a little bit of like the problem that you see. What is your customer really screaming, saying right now, solve this red hot thing?
Yeah, the red hot thing is, we're yeah, a lot of innovation is happening in the DoD and preparation for conflicts that hopefully never happen. And as part of that, we're developing new weapon systems, whether that's hypersonic missiles or autonomous drones or swarms of drones. And even new doctrine, right? The Air Force has something called Agile Combat Employment, which is about how do you actually operate with the Air Force in the Pacific on islands and do sort of split squadrons. What has happened over the last few years is that much of the DoD has woken up to the fact that there's a logistics tail to this, right? So if we're going to have thousands of drones, we need to think about how those drones are going to get fueled, where the spare parts come from, right? If we're shooting missiles in the Pacific, where are those coming from, right? Or if so basically that logistics tail that has often been overlooked is now becoming a priority, right? And even recently, the Department of War published its new priorities, and contested logistics was one of the six, right? Which is actually a relatively novel development. And
Mhm.
so, with Rune, we're sort of fortunate that we started Rune, at the right time. I often think if we had started 6 months earlier, or certainly 12 months earlier, nobody might have actually cared enough to like fund us or to actually, customers, to like invest in us. And now it feels like if we'd started 6 months later, we would have been too late because others also realized there was a there. And so I think the timing was actually pretty important for us.
Yeah. Well, not many people think DoD and think speed and timing. They think, okay, an RFP is coming out in 3 years on something. What's the difference now that it's Department of War? It's not just a title. It's like a complete phase shift. What's that like, as a customer?
I think there's obviously a lot of urgency that we're hearing in the news and in the Department of War around preparing for conflicts that hopefully never happen, right? Like urgent missions. You're right that historically contract mechanisms and innovation efforts didn't actually match up with that urgency. It's like we have to be ready to fight tonight, but we're going to do this 3-year prototype effort to like get there, right? That doesn't really match up. I think so much has changed now, with efforts like the Defense and Innovation Unit, the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, programs like Next Generation Command and Control. There is an urgency now in the innovation of technology and the procurement of technology, and also realization that commercial industry moves really fast, and therefore the Department of War can benefit from that urgency. So I actually think we're now at a time where the urgency of the mission matches the urgency of the acquisition processes, and the administration and the Department of War have done some really valuable reforms there.
That's a huge innovation in its own regard. I mean, thinking about, $1 trillion funded agency of its size to actually get its gear together that quickly. What does
Yeah.
that do kind of on the whip tail to you? I mean, as a early stage developer of technology, like obviously you guys can move fast, but do requirements change? Or, I guess that just means be with the customer, which is why you're in DC as often as possible. Like take us through that. Like where's the nexus and where's the learning and iteration coming from for you guys?
Yeah, I think back to our when we were pitching Rune to our before we had investors. I'd always say the only thing crazier than starting a company is starting a defense company, because it is really hard, and there's just a lot of intricate knowledge needed to how to navigate the Department of War and the acquisition process. And it's unfortunately the kind of situation where it's a moat for anybody who's not deep in that knowledge, and also an advantage for everybody who is. But we've obviously like learned that knowledge and brought a lot of it with us. But what I'm seeing now is that there's many more entry points to that sort of like walled garden of knowledge, right? With the Defense Innovation Unit, Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, in the Army, there's the competition that's X-Tech, where if you're building good technology, there's entrances into the Department of War for you to, so like even if you don't have all the intricate knowledge about acquisition processes or like what contract vehicles to use. The Department of War is trying really hard to find avenues to bring innovation in, and I think that's coming to fruition. And I think competition is deeply American, and I think what's happening now is more competition ultimately than obviously we've moved well beyond just defense primes competing, but just generally programs have more competition going on. That competition ultimately reduces price, improves quality, and I think that's absolutely necessary.
100%. Okay, let's make the problem and really the solution concrete for the listeners, if you will. How is logistics, how is it done before Rune, and how are you guys doing it differently now?
Yeah, it is often done with pen and paper, right? So if you go to basically any logistics unit in the military right now at a certain tactical level, and you ask them how they report their inventory or their vehicle status, or how much personnel they have on hand, they will probably point you to an Excel spreadsheet that may be hung in SharePoint. They will point you to a whiteboard or to a piece of paper that they're sending around, right? And so the processes for this are just absolutely archaic because nobody's really spent the time to innovate, especially at the tactical level, right? Sort of in the Department of War, we think of strategic echelons, right? Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then there's the tactical operational echelons where people are actually fighting. It's especially there where it's really still the Wild West. And what we're changing is a couple of different things. First of all, we're digitizing that. I do believe that even just taking the data that ends up in a spreadsheet or a piece of paper and putting that into a software you can do so much more goodness with it, right? You can automatically aggregate and accumulate it. You can check for errors. You can check, hey, this number looks off by 100%. Did you really mean that? Right? And then the other thing you can do is once you sort of digitize, data collection is you can collect it automatically from sensors. Now, a lot of reporting of logistics data in the Department of War is actually manual in the sense of, to measure fuel, you'll have a soldier or a Marine with a dipstick, dipping that stick into a fuel bladder to see how far up it goes, right? Or to count how many MREs boxes there are. It's really just a soldier counting boxes or counting ammunition pallets and then writing that on a piece of paper. We are moving towards more sensors, and Rune is sort of at the forefront of that,
Hmm.
collecting that sensor data, developing sensors, and that's moving to a world where a lot more of this data is actually collected automatically and then sent up echelon in real time to ultimately also inform production, right? Like, yeah, how do we know how many howitzer rounds we need to build or hypersonic missiles need to be manufactured? Well, we know it based on consumption that's happening at the bottom level.
Hmm. Wow. So a lot of just like unstructured random data, if you will, manually collected now, but hopefully digitally collected. Kind of feels like a little bit, and sorry if the metaphor has been oversaid, but Palantir for military logistics to a certain regard. Is that a fair way to at least look at it?
Yeah, I mean, Palantir and us are great partners, like tackling, sort of the same problem together. And yeah, in a way, I think in the spirit of Palantir of taking unstructured data to solve warfighter problems, that is our spirit as well.
Amazing. Well, I mean, obviously the power of the data collection enables you to have what you said, the data projection, which is the forward looking, right? Which is massive around that, let alone just real-time planning and moving things. Um, is that already in use? Are there bases where you can go and see a screen and this is how it's now being done instead of, pieces of paper?
Yeah, absolutely. I just came from one last night. I came from Fort Carson, Colorado, where we were with the 4th Infantry Division of the Army there, as part of Next Gen C2, which is the Army's largest C2 modernization program that we're part of, both with 4ID in Fort Carson and 25th Infantry Division in Hawaii, which is a little bit warmer. But yeah, TIROS is in use there, as well as in the Marine Corps. And to your other point, you're exactly right that it's one thing to collect the data, a much more important thing to use the data. One thing that I found very interesting about logistics early on is that there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle to even make a single decision, right? Think of, okay, we want to resupply, this platoon of soldiers in the battlefield. You need to know who is available inventory, what vehicles exist to get there, what routes exist to get there, what crews are licensed to drive the vehicles if they're manned. And if you're
Mhm.
missing any of those pieces, you actually do not have a decision. Like you actually need all those different parts to make even a single decision of how to resupply soldiers. And what's fascinating there is that, I mentioned a lot of data is manually collected. Sometimes it is in systems, but when it is in systems, it's in different systems, which means that right now soldiers have to swivel their chair from, 6 different systems just to answer, okay, at this time, this truck is going to from A to B along this route with these crews to drop off some ammunition, right? And that's actually what TIROS is really designed to solve. It's not just the collection of data, it's the use of data to solve logistics problems.
Hmm. I mean, the way you describe it, it sounds like it's not just a military issue, it's an everywhere issue. Can imagine are you already finding commercial uses and people asking as well, getting it pulled into kind of the dual use areas there?
Yeah, the way we think about that is there's kind of a natural progression from a military and Department of War to like the federal government, right?
Mhm.
The more natural landing place would be something like FEMA, right? If a hurricane hits North Carolina, MREs need to be distributed optimally, and sort of visibility of supplies need to be kept. That's something where Tiros could already help today. And then beyond that, it is yes, is perhaps heavy industry or industry in general. Right? One of the unique things about Tiros, our software, is that it works really well in disconnected environments with degraded communications, right, which is kind of like the norm for the Department of War. And so we see opportunities in other parts of commercial industry where that's the norm as well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, that's awesome. That's great. So you're just coming from Fort Carson. What's that like seeing the customer using your tech?
It's really awesome. I think it's not just them using the tech. It's the thing that's actually often most rewarding is when past customers who use Tiros then either go to other units or we just see them again and they're like, it was so awesome to use your software and it really helped me. And it took something that took me 2 weeks and turned it into 3 hours.
Mm.
That's really rewarding, is when we just get people whose lives have improved because of what we've done.
Yeah, that's huge. On this, on hearing it from them, it also makes you feel like you have a responsibility, right? To you can now you can humanize the person on the other end
Yeah.
using your piece there.
And I think the usage of software is really important. A lot of defense or like technology development is driven by military exercises. I think that's a little bit different from commercial industry. We're kind of on some sort of quarterly sprint plan or biweekly sprint plan. In defense, we're really much more driven by, okay, every 6 weeks we have some sort of military exercise. This customer, that customer. Every time we want to demo something new. And the interesting thing there is there's kinds of two kinds of exercises. There is some that are a little bit more, let's try out this brand new concept, see if it works, right? Standing on one leg once and then it, doesn't work again. And then there's other exercises that are just units getting ready to deploy and fight war.
Mm.
And it's very different going to the latter kind of exercise with your software, because if it does not work, they will have no problem just throwing out the window and going back to what they know how to do. So in the former, there's a lot more room for error. You can try new things. In the latter, you really have to make software that is resilient, right? And our customers are often in very high stress environments, and so there's very little friction allowed between our software and their goal of completing their mission.
Mm. Amazing. So you kind of have, I can see a lot of different users, obviously, from down to the soldier, commander, and all the way up. It stacks, and people have different uses for this, I'm guessing, right?
Yeah.
Um, how to take me through a little bit of that? You have a bunch of different lenses of now people seeing things differently. But is it
Yeah.
still at the end of the day the, logistics soldier?
It's interesting, back to how holistic logistics is. When we go to a military unit, we actually don't just talk to the logisticians. And so, there's a couple different sort of functions in a military unit. There's like the personnel function, intel, fires, plans, operations. We of course go to the logisticians, but we also go to the personnel managers. So like the HR individuals who track soldiers and how many are available. We go to the contracting officers. One of the interesting things is when units out of Hawaii deploy to, let's say, the Philippines for exercises, they're not bringing all their vehicles and all their fuel. They're actually doing a lot of their logistics through contracted means, right? So they contract with local trucks or with local fuel sources, and so navigating what's called host nation logistics is actually a huge piece, right? You can imagine if we were fighting in Poland, we would be tapping into like local resources. And so that means that when we go to military units, we talk to the contracting officers. And now increasingly, we've also talked to the medical community. So there's usually a surgeon and individuals responsible for medical evacuation. Because one of the things we learned early on is that figuring out how to optimally resupply units is actually very similar to figuring out how to optimally evacuate patients from the battlefield. Right.
Mm.
So instead of figuring out supplies, vehicles, and routes, you're figuring out what medical treatment facility can I drop them off where they can get the right care, and what medical evacuation assets do I have that can fit the patients and allow them to be rescued.
Wow. Really interesting. So let me summarize a little bit, just like, what I'm hearing. Essentially, you're turning like logistics from this manual reporting into this real-time decision system. It's
Hmm.
this live operational truth, right? But but we're still always thinking and knowing that logistics is this bottleneck. What's the second order effect? What happens when logistics isn't the bottleneck? Like, what do you see that changes for the whole world?
The biggest thing I always go back to is what happens if you don't have Tyros, right? Right. Um, in the best case, you operate just fine, but in the future conflicts, large scale combat operations where things are going to be so fast, so dynamic, we're probably going to get overwhelmed by the amount of decision space. And so,
Mm.
what happens when there's just too many options and too many sort of supply requests coming out of logisticians, and the environment changes too quickly is that you go from being proactive to reactive, right? So instead of planning resupplies and scheduling movements that we have fuel in the right place and ammunition in the right place, logisticians become reactive, right? They're just kind of getting requests thrown at them. Any kind of system goes out the window. It's just like who's dying the most, right? Who's the lowest on fuel, and when we become reactive, we lose the upper hand, right? And so I think of it more as in large scale combat operations where things are dynamic. If we don't have Tyros, we become reactive, and if we become reactive, we likely lose.
Mm, that's kind of dire, obviously.
And a good example early on too is when we were kind of thinking about founding Rune is that was actually not it was obviously still in the middle of the Ukraine war, and if you look at the Russian invasion of Kiev, which luckily failed, the Russians actually ran out of supplies, right? So they had their rocket launchers at the front lines, and they eventually ran out of rockets, and the reason why is because their supply lines got too long, which means on day
Mm,
one they could have gotten one or two rocket volleys to their rocket launchers, but then as those rocket launchers moved forward, their supply lines stayed back. Now it didn't take 6 hours to do resupply; it took like 14 hours, which means you can only do it once a day. And then they ran out of ammunition and therefore got overwhelmed by the Ukrainians. And not that we're not happy of that outcome, but what I saw when I saw that was there was actually nothing, there is no technology that exists in the American arsenal of technology that would prevent our logisticians from running to the same problems, right? We would
mm,
hope that we're just smarter, better, have better tactics, but technologically, there is nothing that we have that will prevent us from running to the same problem on a bad day if things get too fast. And that was a warning sign to me.
hmm. What's really interesting is like the way you describe it, this is really more of like a cognitive problem, not a supply problem, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
really just the overwhelmingness of people and systems. And obviously, technology is amazing at helping
Yeah.
reduce cognitive load by understanding what to work on at the right time, right?
You're very right. It's actually less about, we're going to run out of ammunition, globally or run out of fuel globally. It's about running out of ammunition and fuel in the places that matter and having
Mhm.
too much of it in the places that do not matter, right? And so that's also where, like, let's say our predictive analytics comes in is, yeah, in an absence of data analytics that tells you how much fuel, water, ammunition you take with you, what happens is that people just hoard, right? Well, if I have 15 grenades on me, I'll probably not run out of grenades. But what happens then is the units that actually need those grenades more urgently don't have them because you have them, and because you have more supplies than you need, you are slower, right? You can't move as quickly. And so that's where the intelligence of where supplies are needed now and predictively actually makes us more lethal.
Hmm. Well, let's kind of bring this home. Luckily we're building this for the United States because we believe in, we got to win because we have to survive.
Yeah.
A lot of people talk about the future is the Pacific, right? And if you look at history for the US, it's not about having first or the best first strike. It's about having the operational capacity, right? And doing all of that first. So, one, lucky that you're building here for us. What do you think the future looks like with that, let's say the Pacific conflict, and are there unique needs? Luckily, we've kind of been to Pacific as a country,
Yeah.
but I don't know, like take us through, not obviously logistics and decision tempo being the real deciding factor.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of the Pacific, the term that comes to mind is the tyranny of distance, right? Distances are very vast. It's very dispersed. And that's actually, a big change from how we fought wars in the last 20 years.
Mhm.
And our supply chain, now needs to keep up with it, right? During the global war on terror, we had air superiority, right? Every, defense logistics agency shipments to Iraq made it, right? And that's not going to be the case in the future. And so allocation of supplies being done intelligently and reallocated intelligently, make sure that we don't just shoot a volley of missile on day one. We keep shooting for 30 days until we've destroyed the enemy. And so I think the Pacific is a huge challenge, because of its distance and because of the challenges there. And so I actually think the US military without something like Tyros is going to have a very difficult time in those conflicts that hopefully never happen.
100%. I mean, we've gone from this era of got to have big hulking metal carriers to got to have thousands of mini drones to honestly, we just need the right software as to have the right thing at the right time, right? And
Yeah.
that's what you guys are developing.
And what I think what's important to note there too is it's really about the decision space that increases, right? So
Mhm.
um, humans are incredible logisticians. They can make really good decisions. They
Mhm.
just can't make them fast enough and at the scale that is necessary. And
Mhm.
so when I think of Tiros, it's really about how do we take the most incredible Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force logistician, in those services, supercharge them, and then replicate them 1,000 times, right? So that we can actually keep up with the pace of future conflicts.
Mm. Huge. Well, it's clear that you're working on the right thing at the right time, building the right thing for the right people at the right time too. So, thank you for what you're doing. I think luckily the one thing that might not ever change for us is humans' need for food.
That's
And
right.
luckily this being the Tacos and Tech podcast. But though, by the way, the need for food is powered by logistics. Food
That's right.
we needed at the time we needed, otherwise we can't perform. Uh, so what powers you? What's the tacos that you go and reach for? You got something in DC that's like a go-to or somewhere else?
When I think of tacos, the place I always keep thinking back to is actually not in EC. It is Velvet Taco in Austin.
Hmm.
I just have such fond memories. I lived there for a little bit during COVID, and that place was just amazing. So that's what
It
I think
is
of.
legendary. I'll be there next week. It'll
Nice.
be on my list. 100%. There's so many spots to do. Though Austin, you have to do like barbecue then taco. So
That's right. It's a hard
uh
life.
yeah, yeah, right. Those are the decisions that I would like to be overwhelmed with. That's for sure. Peter, thanks so much for being on the pod, but even more, thanks for what you're working on. Really appreciate it. And I know our listeners will too. So thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's great.
Of course. Cheers.
Tacos and tech is on smash for the green guacamole. Keep accountants counting beans. Contador cuentan frijoles. Founders trying to raise some queso. La vida San Diego. School of rappy, rapping fire. Tortillas round jalapenos. In these modern times of craft beer and coffee. My coding yoga posse. Fold the body. Origami. We be surfing Coronado. Eating tacos el gordo. The taco stand in puesto. Lucha libre and sombrero. Gotta shout out Tecos Daniels by the ocean. Watch the sunset. The Hoya shores. Entrepreneurs trying to get funded. When San Diego Startup Week is popping in the summer. Oceanside to Tijuana. SD be full of hustlers. From couch surfing to penthouses right on the beach. Tech leaders who believe stars are within reach. We interviewing founders who be shooting for the moon. Hashtag SD Tecos with your host Neil Bloom. Come on. Startups get the party. Startups get the party started. Startups get the party. Startups get the party started. Startups get the party. Startups get the party started. You want tech and tacos, tacos and tech. You know we got it. Hey. Startups get the party. Startups get the party started. Startups get the party. Startups get the